Good afternoon, and welcome to the Bulkley Valley Research Center virtual seminar series. Thanks everybody for joining in. It's great to have you here. My name is Dawn Hanson. I'm the Executive Director of the Bulkley Valley Research Center. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting today from the traditional territory of the Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. I'm on the banks of the Bulkley River. I'd like to take a quick minute to thank our funders, the RBC Tech for Nature Foundation, the Wet'suwet'en Community Forest, the province of BC for their gaming fund support are some of our key funders, and as well our members and those of you who come and join in the seminars. Without you coming to watch, we wouldn't host these. So you are a crucial part of the seminar series, and in the way that we are able to share information out and host researchers and practitioners. We're very excited today to be hosting Dr. Kira Hoffman and Dr. Kelsey Copes-Gerbitz, particularly on International Women's Day. They're talking to us today about returning to burning. Western Canada needs boundary spanners to support proactive and innovative solutions to wildfire. Kira Hoffman's a professional fire ecologist and a former wildland firefighter. Her research focuses on how humans have used fire for millennia to manage and enhance natural surroundings, and she uses transdisciplinary methods to understand how present-day forests have been shaped by stewardship techniques such as burning, and how ongoing fire suppression has eroded the resiliency of landscapes. She's currently a jointly appointed postdoc researcher at the University of British Columbia and the Bulkley Valley Research Center, and the Research Center is thrilled that she's been a part of our team for these last 3 years. Dr. Kelsey Copes-Gerbitz is an applied fire ecologist and social scientist who received her PhD in forestry from the University of British Columbia in 2021. Kelsey's research focuses on enhancing community resilience to wildfire through proactive wildfire management and community-led wildfire response in BC. Kelsey's an advocate for connecting diverse forms of expertise to address modern wildfire challenges and collaborates with Indigenous and local communities, the First Nations Emergency Services Society, BC Community Forests, and BC Wildfire Service. Welcome to you both, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. All right, are we ready to get started?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you, Dawn, for those introductions and for having us both here today. I would just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the Squamish territory, unceded Squamish territory down here in the Lower Mainland area. So what we're going to be talking about today, I wanted to give a little bit of a warning beforehand. We will be talking potentially about wildfire disasters and showing images of wildfire. And these images may be triggering if you've been either directly or indirectly affected by wildfire. But what we're really going to try and do is not focus on the doom and gloom of fire, but rather some opportunities for innovation, for revitalizing the critical fire systems that exist here in BC. So a little bit about the two of us. There's a couple things that bring us here together as co-presenters. We both did our PhDs in fire ecology. We love playing with fire. And we actively work to support community-led wildfire resilience. We ourselves are not Indigenous, but we have been fortunate to work closely for and with Indigenous peoples across BC. But we also have complementary expertise. So Kira is a certified fire ecologist from the Association of Fire Ecology, working towards her burn boss certification. And I'm trained as a social scientist in community-based qualitative methods. So these kind of shared interests yet complementary expertise mean that together as a team, we actually can more collectively advance a common goal, getting good fire back in BC. And that's what we're here to talk about today. A couple other quick notes. We will be sharing stories and knowledge that is grounded in our training, expertise, and experiences. We don't claim to have all the answers, but we will also be sharing some stories from others who have contributed to this work, and we do so with permission today.
So thanks. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thanks for that intro, Kelsey. You're going to be hearing us kind of tag team this talk. It is a real collaborative talk, and we're going to be showcasing some of the work that we've been doing over the last few months on complex wildfire problems. So wildfire is that really sticky thing in the room where it's good and bad. It's kind of got a lot of gray area too. It is both harmful and frightening, but also life-giving and really critical to biodiversity for our human and ecological communities. And most people see fire as something, scary on the news. A great example of this is the Chenaman fire that started in late August, and this was within Parks Canada jurisdiction. And you'll see it playing here. It's very visible from the highway. This video is actually taken in late October, and we're actually seeing some pretty hot fire activity. People are getting a little bit nervous. And what Parks Canada did a really good job about here was just explaining that this fire is a modified response fire. It's not really impacting a lot of values. And actually putting this fire out and undergoing fire suppression might do more harm than actual good. And so this kind of extension piece and knowledge exchange of these complex problems is really important in how we change our narrative around fire, how we talk about fire. And we really need this reliable and transparent knowledge exchange now more than ever. British Columbia has a significant history with fire. We have a varied topography. We have many different nations that have been working with fire, living with fire, coexisting with fire for millennia in British Columbia, and so much place-based expertise exists. We've also been implementing fire exclusion for about the last 100 years and really successfully for about the last 30 years. And this has created this wildfire deficit. So we're in a place where we still try and suppress most fires. You'll see that the black outline in British Columbia there is the fire exclusion zone. We don't have a lot of areas where we engage in modified response, which means kind of letting fires go a little bit, seeing where we can kind of let fires run if there's not immediate values at risk. And this is, controversial having these exclusion policies, and it has created a lot of the cumulative disturbances that we see on our landscape today. And in the bottom right, you'll see that the amount of large fires has actually really increased in the last 70 or so years. So since 1950, these are the fires in British Columbia that have exceeded 100,000 hectares. You'll notice that in 2017 and 2018, we have 6 fires now that have exceeded 100,000 hectares. The Plateau Complex exceeded 500,000 hectares. So these are very large fire events. But I think what's really important is it's not just the amount of hectares that are burning, it's the impact of these fires.
So one of the main impacts that we're seeing is, as Kara mentioned, not only around the hectares that are burning, but also about the money that we're spending to try to put out these fires under these fire suppression policies. And here is a graph. It's a little bit complicated, but essentially the gray bars are aligned with the axis on your right-hand side for hectares burned for every year. So the lower the gray bar, the fewer hectares were burned in a given year, the higher the bar, the larger the hectares. So you can see 2017 and 2018 are really significant there. And then followed not too long after by 2021. But when we kind of compare, we kind of split this time period from 1912 to 2020 into two, we can see that actually we've burnt a little bit less on average in the last kind of 50 years or so. There was a cooler, wetter period in the 70s and 80s. And our fire suppression technologies were really advanced. So we see actually a decrease on average every year. But where we aren't seeing a decrease is in the suppression costs. So the black line is aligned with the axis on your left-hand side, and that is an adjusted suppression cost for 2020 dollars. So It's not that the line is lower because it was further back in time when dollars meant less, but that's adjusted for 2020 dollars. And it's also a logarithmic scale. So it's going up exponentially. It's not equal kind of partitions as you go up. And when we kind of look at those same two time periods, from 1912 to around the 1960s, we spent an average of $5.6 million a year on wildfire suppression. Since the 1960s, we've spent an average of $142 million per year. And so these costs are absolutely growing and growing at exponential rates. And this does not even kind of capture or mention all of the indirect economic costs associated with wildfire seasons.
And one thing that we really know is that wildfires are disproportionately impacting Indigenous peoples. Many of the Indigenous communities are located in remote and forested regions where there's not a lot of basic infrastructure and capacity to deal with wildfires. Yet this is really in contrast to the space expertise that exists in both these communities to engage in both prescribed and cultural fire. So it's important to know, that when evacuations do occur, and this is evacuations across Canada, and we're seeing major increases in the amount of evacuations, but when evacuations occur, especially in northern communities, we see a lot of people being removed from their homes and, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, as in the case of Lytton. And there's a lot of societal impacts with evacuations. There's a lot of trauma associated with families being split apart, people being sent thousands of kilometers potentially away from their homes, as we saw in the Alkali Lake fire in Telegraph Creek. And increasingly, we're starting to see people make different decisions and deciding to defy evacuation orders. So the idea of staying and defending is very controversial, and it's never an easy decision. This is Paradise, California. This is the Camp Fire, which happened in 2018. It's the largest recorded fire in California history. This was a hugely impactful and tragic fire. Paradise is one of those communities where there's one road in and one road out. In this situation, evacuation orders came a little bit late. They couldn't have even come soon enough because of the spread rate that had never been seen before and never been recorded before. And unfortunately, many of the people who perished in this fire perished in their vehicles as they were trying to escape. People that had no choice really, but decided to stay and defend were emotionally and physically capable to do so. You'll see the home on the far right there. These people had pumps, hoses, generators, and they were prepared to actually engage with a fire and put out sparks on their roof. They have solar power. There was a lot of different, situations in play in Paradise. But increasingly, we are having these conversations and really tough conversations about what to do if you decide to stay and defend your home. And so in British Columbia, this is playing out in the 2017 and 2018 fires. There's a lot of actually ongoing lawsuits right now. But many people have the training to engage in fire. There's a lot of training that exists outside of agency support. And many people don't have fire insurance, or they have livestock, or they have families that they don't want to split up. So there's a lot of different reasons for staying and defending. And in the US, this has been passed into legislation. So the option to actually stay is a choice, especially if you're an adult and over 18. It's a little bit different when there's children involved. But being evacuated is a very traumatic thing. And this really played out in the Verdun and Island Lake fires in northern BC in 2018, where there was a lot of pressure to leave and a lot of difficult conversations. And, in British Columbia, it's kind of joked that these are defy and die orders, but really it's not taking into account that expertise, that experience that exists in some communities, and having this conversation, be it a difficult one, about how to actually stay and defend and how to do that correctly, and when it might not be a good idea to do so. In Tweedsmuir, this is an area where we see BC's largest protected area being incredibly impacted by wildfire. So we're having a lot of issues with carving off protected areas and seeing the impacts of fire. So in 2017, 2018, and 2021, Tweedsmuir lost half of its forested areas. So 500,000 hectares out of this 1 million hectares burned in fairly extreme fire activity. This is just showing over the last 100 years, approximately, how much fires happened in Tweedsmuir Park. You'll see that it's going up decadally, and then it switches in 2010 to every single year. So the amount of fire that's impacted this landscape, and we're talking Prince George almost all the way to the western border of Tweedsmuir, is fairly breathtaking. And when we don't proactively engage in fire activity, we see the loss of significant values on the landscape. So that includes some of the last ungulate winter range areas for mountain caribou, endangered whitebark pine, really important cultural histories. So we have many habitation sites, and much of this is in the core territory of the Chislata Carrier Nation. And so, we need to start having these kind of difficult conversations again about we aren't really going to have old growth forests on the landscape in these protected areas like OGMAs if we're not proactively engaging in fire. So we can have both. We can have old growth and we can have fire, but we just need the right kind of fire to be applied to these places. And fire can actually really help protect some of these forests and these values against the increasingly severe wildfire activity we're seeing.
And so Kira's really outlined, all of the kind of ways in which wildfire is existing in our modern world, the different kind of impacts that we're seeing. And before we kind of talk about where we're going to go from here, I think it's also important to recognize where we've come from and how our relationship to wildfire and our decision-making around wildfire has changed over time. So this is a kind of diagram that I'll walk through piece by piece, but that demonstrates different eras in the way that we've dealt with fire here in BC. There's 5 different eras, and those are named across the top. And those names really reflect the main, the kind of dominant objectives that we've had around wildfire. What is our relationship to it? Then next down, you'll see a worldview of fire, and a worldview is essentially kind of what do you think about when you hear the word fire? Then the decision-making authority, who has actually been the ones making decisions about fire on the landscape. The next one down is the governance connection between fire and forestry. So we know that those things are really intertwined here in BC, but the way they're connected has really changed through time. And then finally, in the gray across the bottom is some of the main drivers of change between each era. So we begin with a long period of harnessing fire through Indigenous fire stewardship, where fire was considered a benefit. It was intentionally used. Fire-affected landscapes were intentionally stewarded. And these were often, this was done by First Nations and very place-based through intergenerational knowledge, and kind of created a really important kind of patchwork and mosaic across BC's landscape. Fire and forests were not really disconnected. They were kind of considered as being a part of one another. But it really was with the kind of need here in the province of BC to start protecting the timber supply from fire, where we had a dramatic shift in the way that we governed fire. And this really aligned with the creation in 1912 of the Ministry of Forests. And one of the main duties of the Ministry of Forests when it was created was to protect the forests from fire. So it was called fire protection or forest protection. Wildfire was seen as destructive, and it was primarily the Ministry of Forests who was then making decisions. They were often at kind of regional scales, but in these kind of forest regions or districts like we have now. But fire and forestry was still kind of considered by the same people as interacting, but in different ways. It was kind of something that was fire was threatening the forests rather than something that was a necessary part of forests. This was the really dominant narrative of controlling fire for around 50 years, until there was kind of a shift in the province to recognizing actually that fire was really integral to kind of sustainable forest management, to sustainable ecosystems. And there was a strong push really driven by some of the research that was coming out at the time towards recognizing the natural role of fire, trying to emulate it through our forest management practices or reintroduce it in the right ecosystems. So the research branch really kind of helped engage new thinking about wildfire. And this aligned with the same period when the BEC system was created, the Biogeoclimatic Ecosystem Classification System was created in BC. So really recognizing the ecological role of fire. This kind of approach stuck around for around 20 years till the 1990s. And a couple of things happened in the mid-1990s. We saw the emergence of wildland urban interface fires. Yes, they started happening even back then, before that, but these were the ones that were kind of going, oh, okay, this is a new relationship to fire that we have. And the other thing that happened kind of partly in response to these wildland urban interface fires is that the Ministry of Forests, who used to kind of have decision-making authority over fire and forestry, split. And it became a Ministry of Forests and a Wildfire Service. It was called something different back then, but this was called the period, this period was known as the Big Divorce, when fire and forest governance were essentially split off from one another. So we kind of siloed the way that we thought about fire. In some places, we really wanted to suppress it. In some places, we wanted to reintroduce it. Where we wanted to suppress it, fire was unwanted, but where we wanted to reintroduce it, it was natural. And so the BC Wildfire Service and emergency response organizations really started to be key players during this period. And this lasted until 2017. And if you are familiar with the BC context, the 2017 fire season was kind of considered a wake-up call after all the other wake-up calls, but one that really kind of shifted the public consciousness about that fire was going to be inevitable, that we needed to figure out new ways to approach fire. So we've kind of moved into this period now where we're talking about what does coexisting with fire look like? How do we reimagine stewardship? How do we focus on reconciliation as a key driver of reintroducing or kind of revitalizing Indigenous fire stewardship? How do we bring together lots of different players, from the public to the forest industry to emergency response organizations to researchers? How do we bring all those people together to kind of bring together expertise and knowledge to address the complex wildfire challenge? And so one of the big kind of takeaways or impacts from this period when we tried to silo fire and forest decision-making is that we lost a lot of the expertise, or it became really disconnected from one another. This first interviewee talks about, we became a fire department. We waited for the alarm to go off, we went and put out the fire, and we came back to the station. We became disconnected to land management decisions. But the expert on the bottom is kind of talking about the importance of having that connected expertise, how having a better idea of managing the landscape and making decisions on fires might affect or impact forest management. And so with fire exclusion, with fire suppression, we've really lost a lot of the expertise around cultural burning, prescribed burning, and broadcast burning that we need to help revitalize us and get us to a place where we can reintroduce good fire.
So as Kelsey just laid it out really well, our history is, mixed with kind of loving and hating fire. Our history is very mixed with applying fire too. So we used to have a very rigorous broadcast burning program where a lot of silviculture preparation involved broadcast burning in British Columbia, especially here in the north. We have not applied fire in British Columbia in a very, very long time. And now there is a huge push to get more good fire back on the land, more Indigenous-led fire stewardship, more cultural burning, more broadcast burning. But how do we get to a place where we're actually achieving, this fire, whether it's hectares or impact? It's going to be very difficult. We have not put more than 5,000 hectares of burning in British Columbia since about, 2014. So we have a long way to go. the state of New Jersey burns more than all of Canada. The state of Florida burns more than all of Canada. And you can say, well, they have liability to protect them. They have private lands. There's a lot of different situations. But I think that we need to really step outside of agency control in many ways in order to actually make this happen. And this is going to be a mix of applying fire through fire stewardship, through cultural burning, through prescribed burning, but also engaging more in modified response, which is a great way to get those hectares on the land and not be affecting some of the values at risk. So when I'm talking about modified response, again, I'm talking about, when fires are burning under moderate fire weather conditions, it's kind of cooler and wetter, or we know a system's coming in that's going to put a lot of rain on that fire. Why not just let it go and then, protect some of the values at a later date? And so, there is very few people in British Columbia that can actually engage in leading some of these fire initiatives, who have the certifications and training to do that. And we're really missing an opportunity to really engage in some of that place-based expertise that exists within Indigenous communities that may not have the credentials or the tickets required right now to do this. So when I'm talking about prescribed burning, what I'm talking about is the intentional application of fire on land. This is a prescribed burn that took place in the city of Cranbrook. So this is right in the city limits. It's the collaboration with BC Wildfire, with Ktunaxa Nation. And you can see that, there's some pretty good flames. There's actually quite a few people sitting out there in lawn chairs because their homes are right next to it. And they're just watching this go down. This fire was about 7 hectares. It was out by lunch. The venting conditions were good. The mayor was there. This is what you'd call a successful prescribed burn. And this burn is not just a one-off. It's going to need to be done every 5 years to get kind of those fuels under control. And so we're increasingly see places, especially municipalities, that are taking the lead and actually saying, we need to protect our communities. How can we do it? Let's get some public buy-in for actually engaging in these prescribed burns. And these also act as a great training opportunity for, prescribed burn applications through agencies, but also external. So researchers can come and actually experience what a fire looks like, hold a drip torch. Community members can be involved. And it's a great collaborative way to kind of reimagine a landscape with fire. And when I'm talking about Indigenous-led fire stewardship, what I'm talking about is a really community-centered approach that is really distinct and belongs to each nation that practices it. This is a picture from Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen. These are her 2 daughters, 3 and 5, and they're burning out on their property. And this is a perfect example of just a small burn where children are involved. There's often grandparents involved. It is really community focused because a lot of it involves intergenerational teachings. It's really conducted under low risk conditions, sometimes at night. A lot of these kind of key components of cultural burning don't often align with some of the prescribed burning protocols where you need PPE, so personal protective equipment. There's often like dozers and lines where you're trying to stop the fire spread. And sometimes it can just seem like a bit too much for some of these very small and light burns that are trying to foster a practice that has in many places suffered loss. And also, I think it's also really important to note that Indigenous fire stewardship often includes lightning ignitions and Indigenous firefighting practices. So it's not just the actual burning, it's a whole network of caring for the land and having lightning work with you to do, kind of get the job done to actually, there's a lot of examples of cultural burns being burned up to lightning ignition. So the idea of kind of creating this mosaic on the land. And as kind of agencies and the public is becoming more supportive of Indigenous-led fire stewardship, there's also a bit of a pushback from communities. And so this is part of the work that I've been engaged in, where many people are kind of experiencing this whiplash where they've been there and ready to burn for decades, and now they're being asked to be part of things. And so, one person told me, when they went to a burn to try and help, they said, the next time you get caught burning, you'll go to jail. That was a situation where someone had lit a fire, an agency came to put it out, and was threatened with jailing and fining. And now those same agencies are coming and asking this person to light fires for them. And so there's kind of this trust that needs to be built, some real engagement and presence involved, as well as in some cases, just kind of letting that Indigenous-led fire stewardship happen just on its own.
And so we've kind of previewed several pathways towards this idea of coexisting with fire, highlighting really that wildfires are inevitable. We aren't going to be able to suppress our way out of this challenge, but really underpinning how important everybody's role is in this complex challenge. The only way to address a complex challenge is by having complex people and complex forms of expertise at the table. And so kind of where we're going to move to next is really thinking about, how do we intentionally implement some of these pathways? How do we be really specific in the way that we design where we want to go? Understanding all this kind of complex history, different needs, different values across the land base. And so one of the ways that we're kind of highlighting here today is these processes that help bring together multiple forms of expertise. When I talk about expertise, I'm kind of using this to describe the worldviews, lived experiences, and trainings that different people have throughout their lives, whether it's researchers or elders or forest managers, whoever it might be, they have their own form of expertise. But we really get quite preoccupied in trying to label that expertise. We do it all the time. We are here as researchers, but we call expertise, so it's Indigenous expertise or it's Western expertise, or it's fire expertise or forestry, or it's natural science and it's social science, or it's research expertise and management expertise. But really what we need is all of these things. We need people to be boots on the ground. This photo was taken of me with some elders, forest managers, archaeologists, and it was taken by my mom. Like, we all were out in the forest together, talking about what the forest meant and what we wanted to do and where fire really fit into that. And so it's these processes that we need to bring together multiple forms of expertise. One of the challenges that we face with expertise is that it's valued by different people in different ways. Many, Kira and I have some letters after our names and some degrees, and often those are seen as being more valid or more valuable than the expertise of an elder. And really that's not the case at all, especially in these kind of place-based settings. These different forms of expertise need to be valued the same way and in different ways for the different contributions that they can bring. When we don't value expertise, we kind of not have respect for these different forms of expertise, we can tend to focus on these kind of checkbox exercises, tokenism of integrating knowledge. And integrating is really talking about, we're going to stay on the same path, but we're going to integrate some other kinds of knowledge because we know it's important. That's not a collaborative process. That's not bringing together multiple forms of expertise. Rather, really, collaboration is about creating these pathways for multiple forms of expertise to be brought together based on mutual respect, integrity, and trust. And I think one really good example here in BC is the example of the proactive wildfire management work that community forests are doing. So they've been implementing a wide diversity of proactive approaches across different scales, and fuels treatments that include prescribed and cultural fire are often the most common and the ones that they really want to be doing, but face different challenges and barriers to doing that. But no matter what community forest manager we spoke to about, how are you actually able to do those things? Or how do you think, what do you need to be able to do those things? It was about relationships. It was about good relationships with the community members, so that the person from down the road who stops you in the grocery store is willing to kind of listen to what you have to say, and you're willing to listen to them as well about what their values and needs are. It's about relationships with agencies who are currently in the process we're in, kind of signing the prescriptions for some of these things. It's about relationships with the funding agencies who are making a lot of this work happen, because currently it's not economical. So those relationships are really, really critical. And we can kind of build on some of these good examples to think about what the role of a boundary spanner might be.
So this is kind of in a nutshell, our talk right here. This is an infographic that Kelsey and I created to kind of talk about why we need boundary spanners. And you might be wondering, well, what is a boundary spanner? This actually comes from economics. These are people that can help make transactions a little bit simpler. In our world, we're trying to apply it to our relationship with fire and our relationship with each other. So boundary spanners can be people, they can be organizations, and what they're doing is they're actually just like straddling boundaries. They are trying to increase communication. They're trying to lift up underrepresented voices. They're willing to hear other sides. They're willing to speak for people who haven't been given a voice, if that's appropriate. They're facilitating all sorts of capacity building. So, for example, sometimes, agencies, even departments within the same agency, don't talk. We've seen that with the Great Divorce that Kelsey talked about. There's practitioners that are not aware of research that's happening. There's researchers who are trying to be practitioners but don't understand kind of the limitations, the barriers to actually doing that. And so, we've gotten together as a group, and this kind of includes many fire practitioners, Indigenous knowledge holders, fire scientists within the Western and Indigenous context, coming together to try and say, okay, we need to support boundary spanners doing this knowledge exchange, knowledge mobilization to kind of get us on this path. This is not reinventing the wheel. There is places where boundary spanners are incredibly valued. If you look at extension services that exist in California, for example, there would be a knowledge exchange and extension person assigned to kind of each fire center. So imagine if Northwest Fire Center had an extension specialist in fire, and the Southeast had an extension specialist in fire, and their whole job was research and extension. And so this is kind of what we hope to see in the future with British Columbia. We have people who are engaging these activities right now, but it's not quite valued. And so kind of our next step is, how do we really value people who are engaging in these roles? Many people do this off the side of their desks. There's not adequate funding sources to support this knowledge extension. And yet everyone loves a really good infographic, and people love when ideas are communicated in accessible ways. And so it's this combination of science communication, science art, really having not just biophysical and social science realms, but really having people that kind of can go between them very easily. And many times people don't have to be scientists at all. These are people who have the skills necessary to engage with people too. And that's really important. Is boundary spanning isn't really for everyone, but there is training that you can do to make yourself better at communicating across disciplines, making sure that you can kind of talk to anyone about any issue. And so, there is places where we can really carve off a space to actually have boundary spanners in the context of fire in British Columbia.
And so now we're going to kind of draw on a few more examples about some of the potential pathways forward that might exist. And the first one is kind of going back to what Kira was mentioning around extension specialist positions. And these are people in dedicated positions. In the US, they're often called professors of practice. So they are embedded within a university, but they are locally or regionally located. So they're not located where the university is centered, but where the communities are centered, where the action is happening. And their sole purpose is to understand the relationships between needs in the public and research that's happening. Oregon State University has 6 regional extension specialist positions, one for kind of each area of the state. And then a central hub. And so they communicate with each other, they work on projects together. And there's also the joint fire science exchange networks that are built to create kind of accessible opportunities for knowledge exchange. And so there are examples like this that already exist that would be relatively straightforward to kind of create into a BC context that would be really useful. Another one is some of the kind of work that's already actually happening here in Western Canada. This is an example of fire art that is led by Peter Hollab out of the BC Wildfire Service and the Caribou Fire Center, who collaborated with a local artist who's seen pictured there doing a live painting of a day that we had out in the forest with elders of an area that's planned to be burned. And just using art as a way to talk about fire, as a way to talk about the different values that exist on the landscape. And you can see some of that. They're working there with UNESTine, some of the youth, some of the elders, and just expressing maybe relationships to fire in different ways.
There's also a program, this is work by Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen and myself, trying to get some really good curriculum into BC schools on the benefits of burning. So how fire can be good for biodiversity, how we can have a different relationship with fire. And I think that the whole idea here is just trying to recreate that narrative from a young age, because the first thing you really learn in school is don't play with matches. We're really trying to kind of shift that into, fire is not the enemy. Fire is something that can be good, and, it can be used safely. And maybe you want to grow up to be a fire practitioner instead of just a fire suppressor. And so really trying to get this in right now. It's being presented in some of the elementary schools in Gatineau. And this is just a great opportunity to have kids come out and we can actually do a small burn. And the kids are really excited about actually using fire and seeing people use fire, which is not something that's often experienced by children. Another really big thing we try and do is be empowering other women who are in fire. So there's a long history of this being kind of a rough place for women. And, we understand that wildfires are dangerous and we need a chain of command, but when the majority of fire workers are white and male and agency-based and very few women, as well as BIPOC and two-spirited LGBTQ+ are in positions of power, it creates this self-perpetuating culture where they really excel at rapid response, putting fires out, fire suppression, but are a little less effective at addressing kind of emerging challenges and proactive fire solutions. And so less than 10% of fire agency positions are women, and fewer than that are underrepresented groups in leadership roles. So we want to make sure that we're actually creating a culture where we can be innovative. We're seeing fire suppression systems fail. We've seen that in British Columbia. We've seen it throughout Western North America. And so why not try potentially different ways of doing things, different ways of understanding systems? And if we increase representation, then we're going to increase all the different ways of thinking about things. There is going to be the first women's trucks happening in Canada. This is actually a great opportunity for women to really engage in trying fire for the first time, or having some of the fire practitioners actually, practicing fire. It's a great opportunity for mentors and mentees to come together, and really a supportive learning experience. And so the whole goal of this is to have, women being able to kind of push boundaries and maybe, help them establish roles as leaders for the future. Another important kind of thing as we start to think about fire on the landscape is that, yes, we need fuel reduction, and we do need it at a staggering scale. This is a great example of a cup block where fuel has been left for years. It's still sitting there, but we need to be cleaning up our forests. We need to be taking care of our forests. So how do we do that? Is it really, do we need a forester to come in with a forester lens? Yes. Do we need a fire ecologist to come in with a fire ecologist lens? Yes, we all need to work together. We need to have these diverse knowledges really help shape our future, especially if we're going to be dealing with more intense wildfire seasons, with increasing, rapidly changing climate. But we also need to understand our limitations and scope. And so asking for help when we need it, understanding that we all have a scope of practice and that we need to be collaboratively working together. I wouldn't go and lay out a cup block. I wouldn't have any idea what I was doing, but it would be really nice if fuel mitigation is going in around communities. If a fire ecologist, let's say, is being asked for their support on a project. So really having foresters and fire people work together. That divorce, of course, is just still kind of hanging there. But there is a chance to have a more collaborative future.
And as I said at the beginning, we don't have all the answers, and there's some really big questions out there that are going to be really important when we think about how do we enable boundary spanners? How do we move into these next steps where decision-making is more collaborative, where we are bringing together multiple forms of expertise? How do we enable this type of collective action? Who's going to pay for it? When it's not valued, it becomes really, really difficult to continue to do this work off the side of your desk. How do we make it an incentive? How do we incentivize it and build it into our systems, our expectations of a job role, or creating new job roles for this? And how can our kind of legislation and policy landscapes help support this? I think, the requirements, adding more requirements can always be challenging, but requirements that might recognize the need to engage in multiple forms of expertise in ways that's not just integrating, but is kind of true collaboration. And this will help us get us towards connecting multiple ways of knowing, bridging opportunities for communication, and ultimately learning to coexist with fire. And the progress that we need is not going to happen overnight. It's taken us a really long time to get to where we are today. But if we prioritize trust and relationship building, we're going to go a long way to helping enable application of Indigenous-led fire stewardship and cultural burning, as well as prescribed fire by agencies, local communities, and practitioners.
That's the end. Yeah, we're happy to take any questions. And just to note that it was a super collaborative effort, and that many ideas and conversations about this work have been contributed by some really powerful leaders in the fire science community.
Thank you so much,
Thanks,
Kelsey.
everyone.
Kira.